Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Jericho Perez. I'm a partner with Vicente Cederberg. Really excited to have you guys today. We have two guests today, Adam Fayne with Saul Ewing, Arnstein and Lair LLP, as well as Amanda Kilroe, counsel in our Los Angeles office for Vicente Cederberg. Excited to talk with you guys today. Like I said, my name is Jericho Perez. I'm on the board of directors of the National Hispanic Cannabis Council, also on the legal committee. Our legal committee today is going to have a roundtable discussing generally topics of interest and legal issues happening in the cannabis industry. And this month's topic is cannabis real estate considerations and best practices for approaching real estate in the cannabis industry. Really happy to have Adam and Amanda with us today to discuss these issues. We're going to go over some questions. We'll also take questions from the audience if there are any. I'm going to start with letting Adam and Amanda give an intro. Adam, go ahead.
Sure. So my name is Adam Fayne. I'm a lawyer at Saul Ewing, Arnstein and Lair. We are a 400 plus lawyer law firm, national law firm. I think we have 16 offices these days. I'm the co-chair of our cannabis practice. I focus mainly in the transactional cannabis space. I have a regulatory partner who co-chairs the practice with me. And, for cannabis purposes, we represent people applying for licenses, startup cannabis operators, single state operators, all the way up to, we've probably been a part of 15 of the go public transactions and represent some of the larger players on their day-to-day legal needs. For the cannabis real estate purposes, that's today's topic. We represent the cannabis companies in negotiating their leases or acquisitions for cannabis property. We also represent some of the public as well as the private REITs in their sale leaseback opportunities that we'll get into. I'm really excited to be on the panel here today with everyone from Vicente. We've worked with Vicente, across the country with some of their offices, and we've had some really good experiences with you guys. And thank you for having me today, and I'm excited to be here with you.
Thanks, Adam. Amanda?
Cool. Hey, everyone. My name is Amanda Kilroe. I am the head of the licensing department in the California office, and also now helping to spearhead a lot of the applications in New Jersey, which has a similar sort of landscape. I would say, the biggest part of what we do is, taking an applicant from, the very beginning process of securing a local and state license, through actually securing that license. And the first step in all of the processes is actually securing the real estate. And so I'm excited to talk to everyone today about, what are some of the, the things to watch out for to make sure that you end up with a property that you like, because, in a lot of jurisdictions, it's really hard to relocate. And so you might be there for many years.
Thanks, Amanda. And just a reminder, this is a live session presented by the National Hispanic Cannabis Council. Our mission is to educate the U.S. Hispanic community on health, wellness, and economic aspects of cannabis to empower and support their participation in the industry. We'll be having these every month about all kinds of different topics with all kinds of speakers, hopefully some regulators coming up soon. So I encourage you to tune in every month. So let's start out with talking about some of the major mistakes that you guys see as far as cannabis real estate and how to avoid those mistakes in cannabis real estate transactions. Adam, I'll let you start us off if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. I think the number one mistake, and I've got to imagine Amanda's going to agree with me on this, is is making sure that you tee up the contracts with a sufficient amount of time to close on the deal because of the regulators. So what I mean by that is this: you can't simply buy a piece of real estate and put a dispensary in there, or put a cultivation or processing facility in there. You typically almost always need some sort of regulatory approval. And so when you're looking at a transaction, you have to be forward thinking about that. You have to think about whether the town is going to allow you to have a processing facility there, whether the town's going to allow you to have a dispensary there. And not only whether they're going to allow you, how long is that going to take, right? A lot of times you have to go through, zoning committees. You have to go through special use permits. And when you're dealing with the government, any government, that just takes a lot of time. So sometimes
always double at least, right?
at least. I don't want to get off topic. We'll talk about New Jersey in a second, but that's a frequent mistake we see, is where people have like a 90-day close, and then all of a sudden they have this great piece of property. They're nowhere close to getting permission from the town. So there's a lot of risk that if they close, they'll never be able to open up. And then it starts costing our clients a lot of money to keep buying these extensions. So upfront negotiate as much due diligence time, as much condition time as possible. Then once you're sort of in the real estate, and Amanda will talk about kind of what you need from a licensing regulatory perspective to actually sit in the real estate. But from a another mistake that we often see is, and this happens both on the landlord and tenant side, is somebody will go to a landlord, or the landlord will market itself for cannabis use, not realizing that they have bank debt on the building. If they have bank debt on the building, it's usually a deal killer, because by putting a cannabis tenant into a piece of property, you typically are going to blow one of your bank covenants, because you're putting a federally illegal operator into your property. So it's really important up front to find out if the property that you're negotiating or marketing has bank debt, and if they're going to get an exception to that. I mean, if you're dealing with JP Morgan, Bank of America, there's no chance. But some of the more local banks will maybe give you an exception, and so forth.
Adam, would you say that there's also a related thing where if you're trying to get a loan for a property, if you want to purchase, that kind of federal bank issue would also come into play?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. It's I would say virtually impossible. I would say impossible. It's very difficult to get a loan.
Never say never.
Never say never. I mean, the reality is you can get the loan, but your cost of capital, where you think where traditional commercial property debt is, say anywhere from 4 to 7% for a high risk asset. I mean, the cost of capital in this business is double or triple that. But there are solutions out there, and so that's a really good point. You got to go in there with the expectations that you're either going to be paying cash, or you're going to find some high cost of capital.
Private investor maybe.
Yeah, private investor, or we represent some. There are publicly traded cannabis REITs out there, as well as there's private REITs that just have raised a lot of money, and they're putting it to work, and they're looking for good operators to put their money behind, and that's a potential solution.
Got it. Thanks, Adam. Yeah, and I'm hearing you guys talk a lot about certain things you need to consider in these leases and agreements to mitigate these sort of risk and mistakes. Amanda, I'd love to hear a little bit more from you about those lease considerations that people should be thinking about as far as licensure go, because I heard Adam talk about this timing component, right? And I think there's also not just the timing, but in a lot of these licensing processes, are you even going to end up with a license and be able to use the property, right?
Yeah, that's right. And I'll say too, in terms of timing, as you were saying that, Adam, I was thinking also the opposite is true, where we've had clients in the city of LA, for example. They've been holding, I had a client who was holding property for like 16 months before the actual phase 3 round 1 licensing period opened. And so, you're also dealing with that when you're saying like have a really long lead time for due diligence. I also think like a related thing is to, include include terms in that, in your deal document that allow for, maybe we're only paying half the rent until the cannabis business is up and running, or maybe, there might be like a for 6 months we don't pay rent or things like that. In terms of cannabis terms in a real estate document, I think it's really important, especially in the state of California, to really make sure that you enumerate exactly what you're doing. So for example, if it is a manufacturing facility, you need to be saying in that document that where the agreed use is manufacturing of cannabis products. And so I've seen, and this is kind of earlier days, but I'm sure this you'll get this in kind of newer states that are coming online, is excuse me, is the landlord or the property owner doesn't want to actually say in the document that that you're doing cannabis, and so they might want to put like a storage facility or whatever, or processing plant, but they won't put the cannabis use language in there. And that is a big problem, especially in California, because the state and the localities will come back at you and say like, no, we need to know that the landlord knows exactly what you're doing here. And so you need to provide that in the lease. And then a lot of localities and the state will also, require a second document, which is just a one-page property owner acknowledgement where it says like, yes, we know cannabis is happening in here and here we're signing for it. So these are things you want to consider. And I guess a related thing too is like that related to another term in the lease is, length of the lease. So it's kind of a tricky situation, because on the one hand, you don't want to sign a huge, you don't want to sign a lease for 20, 30 years if you're not sure how long, then you might be on the hook in case the business fails. On the other hand, if you signed a shorter term lease, I've just seen a lot of predatory landlords come back in and say, well, now you're doing great, we want to double the price, we want to double the rent. And then I would also make sure that you include some language in the document that says like the landlord will sign, continue to cooperate to sign any documents required by the locality or the state, because again, we have seen landlords just basically hold people ransom. It's like the city actually needs you to sign this. Yeah, Adam, have you had that experience?
Yeah, no, it's a great point. Great point. Yeah, you want a continuing cooperation clause in a lease, because otherwise, yeah, you're right. They can hold you hostage.
Well, we've seen just, and again, this is the city of LA example, they have to re-sign these every year with the renewals. The landlords have to sign 2 forms. We had one client who the landlord was like, I'll do it for $5,000. And it's, which, red in the face about that, but it's just these things that you want to kind of make sure to handle on the front end.
Yeah.
Right.
Plus, and with that, when you go to expand, when your clients go to expand their cultivation facilities and all that type of stuff, and you have to go back to the state to get permission, like you mentioned, California and Massachusetts is like that, and there's Maryland, most states are like that.
Yeah,
you want to get that continuing cooperation. I think you also brought up a really good point on the length of the lease. It's an excellent point, because you want to have flexibility there. What you listeners are going to realize, if you don't know already, to build out these facilities is extremely expensive. I mean, you're talking a bunch of lawyers here on the call or on the Zoom, and even we're expensive, not because necessarily not necessarily because our hourly rate is very high.
We're part of the problem. Is that what you're saying?
I mean, it just takes so much time and so much work to get these deals done that everyone's going to spend so much time and money to do this that you don't want to ever have to move. So it's a really good point that you made about the length, because not only are you spending a bunch of money just to get the property zoned correctly, then you got to build it out. Now the average dispensary, depending on the size, might not be terribly expensive, right? You might be talking anywhere from, probably, you can bootstrap it around, 300,000, but you can build a really, amazing dispensary for 7 figures. And then if you have to move, you're going to be screwed. So that's a really, really good point.
And then, but what do you think about the converse though? Because I had another client whose their business failed after 2 years, but they had signed a bond, for this really long lease. So I don't know. I just think it's you have to counter that. I'm not sure.
No, that's a really good point. I mean, that's I'd rather I think in
Be
my
optimistic.
opinion, at least. Yeah, right. Yeah, you're right. I mean, like, you'd rather be managing the upside return versus the downside risk. I mean, you got to manage both. Don't get me wrong. I mean, it's a good point.
Yeah. It's just a tough situation to be put in.
Yeah. And the other thing is, one thing that I think everyone should be aware of, and Amanda, you probably are doing a ton of this stuff, is in the old days, you used to have real estate to get a license, and it would be extremely expensive. So in Illinois, for example, or Massachusetts, Maryland, all these states, whatever. In order for you to get a license, you would have to identify a piece of property, lock it up, pay 10, 20,000 a month just to hold it. And sometimes it could take 1, 2, 3 years before you find out if you even win. If you lose, you just lost millions of dollars holding a piece of property.
Yeah.
The states have become a lot more familiar with that, with these social equity programs. And in Illinois, for example, you do not have to have a piece of property now to get a license. You have 6 months with the opportunity to extend for another 6 months after you're awarded the license to find the property. They're trying to be a little more social equity friendly. I'm curious, Amanda, kind of what's going on in New Jersey? Isn't there something like that happening there?
Yeah, and I was going to say, like, that's really heartening to hear because, I think one of the, I had a cannabis manufacturing edibles company in California during the medical market. And I really loved that community. Everyone kind of, bootstrapping and helping each other out and talking about whether LED lights are better than halogen, that kind of stuff. All felt very communal. And I think, this real estate requirement for a lot of people really prices out a lot of those kind of legacy operators. And so it's nice to hear that. And in California, there are some localities, like West Hollywood really wanted to be, have this kind of social equity component and letting smaller operators actually have a chance. And so they, allowed you to submit without a property, but then even some of the winners who won without a property never actually were able to move forward because turned out that, they didn't kind of realize the expenses or how limited the property was. So even in those situations, like you're saying, I think you said Illinois, where they don't require the property, it still has to be forefront of your mind. And, New Jersey, they have this conditional application where you can apply without a property, but I think after you're approved, you only have 120 days to submit. So you're still in this kind of weird timing limbo. So I feel wary of, I've been advising my clients, most of them don't meet the kind of the income threshold requirements, but I've been suggesting the annual anyway, because I think people always think that getting the license is going to happen much faster than you think. And so, like you said, sometimes you can be waiting, years to find out if you won. Then you have to apply for the conditional use permit. Then you have to do the build out. So these. I'm happy to hear that.
What about New Jersey? That first round of licenses, they were required to have huge cultivation facilities, and then there's the lawsuits that delayed it, and people had to hold on to these massive properties for years, and then they just started dropping them, and no one knew if they were going to be disqualified or not because you had no clarity. So it's.
I was gonna say Jericho could probably speak to that too. I feel like you are involved.
Yeah, I think you guys have made a great point about this timing issue. And I think that's one reason it's so important to talk to somebody like one of you, a legal professional who understands these issues, because even in Illinois, while they don't require a property now, most everyone went into that licensing process 2.5 years ago with a property, thinking they did have a property. They did enter into these sort of purchase agreements or lease agreements for long-term periods, thinking that they had to. They didn't have to, but just because the state said you didn't have a property, some of them were still stuck paying for those properties, even though these lawsuits are still holding up the licensing process. So it's so important that you're considering all of these things before you're signing one of these agreements and building in the right contingencies and conditions to protect yourself. We do have a question from the audience, Adam, on something that you were saying. What size dispensary could you bootstrap for 300,000 and in what state?
I mean, I've seen people, 2,500, 3,500 square foot dispensaries,
Yeah.
Get them open for a few $100,000. I'm talking about the build out costs. I'm not talking about everything else that comes before that, or working capital or anything like that. But you probably build it out for a few $100,000, just get some kiosks in there. Typically you have to, build out the security, the cameras. A lot of states require, safes and safe rooms and all that type of
Man
stuff.
traps and
yeah. I mean, you could, 300,000 is reasonable to get a shop open. Now, you have some of these large MSOs that many, multi-state operators, that are spending a lot more money than that to give the customer, a true customer experience as opposed to just opening up a shop and selling cannabis. So, those guys, those companies are spending multiples of that, but you could get one open for a few $100,000.
Yeah, I would say in states like Oklahoma and Michigan, that's probably, costs are going to be a bit lower than you're going to see in California and these limited license states, or East Coast, like New Jersey, upcoming New York. And speaking of cost, I did want to hear you guys discuss a bit about understanding actual monthly cost in leases and in real estate and cannabis generally. You've both touched on that a little bit, but let's just talk about, how our listeners, as these tenants, can make sure, they're talking to somebody to understand what are all the considerations in the actual cost, not necessarily just the lease cost, by month for a cannabis property.
Oh, Adam, my big one. I don't know if you agree, but my first one off the head is security. So a lot of states, especially with storefronts, require 24-hour security guards. And I have a client who told me just last week they pay $20,000 a month for like these multiple armed security guards. They have 3 licenses across a couple buildings. But would you agree? You think that I think
yeah, I mean, I think definitely at the retail level, security, no doubt. Because like you said, some of them are 24/7. What else? I think that some of these states, and I don't know, I mean, many of these states require these reinforcements. I don't know how to describe it exactly, but inside the building, where like you have to have like a steel walk-in inventory safe where, it's the size of your bedroom. And those are like really that expensive.
There's like I think it's called a C2D2 room for volatile manufacturers in California, and those things are really expensive too.
Yeah, I mean, and we're talking about retail cultivation. I mean, your expenses are, power is huge, and sometimes depending on the size of what you're building, you have to bring in the power yourself, especially like these New York. Yeah, these New Yorkers. I mean, they're all paying for the utilities to come to them. But power on a monthly basis is going to be your big. I mean, besides labor,
and water.
Water. You're right.
For cultivators.
Water, yeah. And you have testing, right? You got to pay for testing. So all the products you're growing or manufacturing has to get tested. That's a big expense. One solution that is out there are these sale leaseback companies. So I mentioned that, we do some work for these companies where they basically will finance the acquisition of the building itself. And then they'll also finance your build out. And so basically, let's say the building's worth, $2 million. They'll give you $4 million because they'll underwrite the building at $2 million. They'll give you the $2 million for your improvements to build it out. So it's not easy to get those loans because, as you can imagine, what we're underwriting, what our clients are underwriting is the credit of the tenant, right? Because if you go south with their $4 million, in my hypothetical example, the building's not worth $4 million. They're out the money. So they have to underwrite the building, but they really have to underwrite the tenant themselves. So it's a little bit harder for a startup to get that type of capital. It's not impossible, but if you have some sort of background in cannabis or you're coming from a different, another company that you have a proven track record, might have a possibility. I mean, what are you seeing out there, Amanda, as far as, capital for these, for startups and so forth?
Yeah, I think it's really difficult. And again, if you do need kind of, I think that is a huge consideration. And so I would look at, social equity cities if the financing is a big issue.
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah.
Like we see in the city of LA, if you want to, open a storefront, the most recent round of licensing was gave priority to people who gave the social equity applicant 51% ownership. And so, that person comes in with they're bringing the social equity piece, and then, they're partnering with these bigger operators. But yeah, I think it's really tough. I had a friend who was applying for a license, a storefront license in New Mexico, found a great property, went to the bank. Kind of didn't realize the sort of banking issues, and said, I would like to get this $400,000 to purchase this property. And I mean, she couldn't have turned him around quicker, like back out the door. And she was very apologetic, apparently, but there really is just this, the banks can't do it. So yeah, I'm seeing people have to get these kind of short-term high interest rate loans, which feels predatory. And but it's the financing is tough.
Yeah, I don't know about California, but Illinois and New York now are starting to have these social equity funds where,
yeah, that's right.
Where people can apply and get, I don't know if it's a loan or free money. But
I think it's both. It can be both.
Yeah. Oh, is it good? Yeah. So hopefully more states will do that.
Yeah, I think the city of LA recently gave their phase 3 round 1 social equity applicants $25,000 to each one of them, which was very cool. But we have several clients that are like pro bono social equity clients, and these application forms, like we're filling them out and even I'm like, I got to get some clarity on this and that, because they're not intuitive. So it's kind of frustrating that, even the barrier to entry, even to the social equity program, can feel sort of, insurmountable if you don't know, if you don't know how to read these forms, I guess.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think that's a good point. And I think it's really important too that we let everybody know, it's so important to start this search early, right?
Sure.
As far as timing, especially in established jurisdictions like California, where landlords are now much more familiar with cannabis operations and what they can get for a cannabis operations. And we're seeing localities and municipalities really limit zoning, right, Amanda? So, how should potential licensees and people who are new to the industry, which I think is a lot of our audience, handle that? Do you have any advice there?
Yeah, and I think that when you're looking at a locality, and I guess once you select a locality, I think you have to go visit the website first, because some cities are really cooperative and they will provide a zoning map that shows exactly like which areas you can operate. Or I was working with a town in New Jersey recently where they were like, look, we're a small locality. We're actually going to give you the list of the 20 properties that are zoned correctly for this. And so, I think that I think you can use the city as a resource. But yeah, you're totally right that zoning is a big way that cities really can restrict and have control over, where they're going to allow cannabis activity. And so I would say give yourself a lot of time, work with the city, work with your attorneys. In some cities too, I was just thinking that the setbacks is also a big consideration. And this one is really tricky because, each city will have different requirements for what a setback might be. I worked with a client a couple of years ago, and the city had a requirement about you couldn't be within 1,000 feet of a youth center. There was a Brazilian jiu-jitsu center just down the street. And it didn't occur to any of us that would be considered a youth center, but technically the definition is if you have more than 51% of your classes are kids under the age of 18, counts as a use center. So that was something that was only found out because the client had hired like a professional surveyor, because he didn't want to spend all the, you don't want to put $1 million into a property that ultimately would get rejected. But these are things that a separate consideration too, especially when you get to bigger cities, where there are a lot of there might be more youth centers or schools or churches or whatever it is that the locality it doesn't allow.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
we
And I
actually
think there's so much to get into on the zoning and permitting front, and we definitely want to get into that. But real quick, one more quick question from the audience back to cost. What are the interest rates and terms for sale leaseback deals that you guys are seeing right now?
So ignoring, say, the top 5 operators in the country, you're seeing typically between 12 and 18%, I would say. With escalators, typically there's a 2 to 3% bump a year.
Got it.
Yeah, that's shocking.
Yeah.
All right.
Some of the top publicly traded cannabis companies are finding much cheaper debt, still more expensive than commercial, but your average cannabis company is probably paying 12 to 18.
Do you think it's better to rent? If you're a smaller operator and finances are an issue, I think I think renting is probably the preferred option over buying. But like we've kind of been discussing, I'd probably agree that if you are leasing, that comes with its own set of hurdles, because then you're you're at the whim of the landlord, who can try to raise rent or decide they don't want cannabis in their building anymore, whatever it is.
Right. All right, so let's get into the conversation a bit more on the licensing side. And, we've talked about the property agreements and landlord tenant issues. What are the considerations as far as securing the property with the locality, with even the state, but getting all the permits and things you need, complying with zoning? Can you guys talk a bit about that? Amanda, we can start with you.
Okay. Yeah, sure. So like I said, kind of in my intro, the most important, the kind of the first piece is securing the property, right? And so I would say that really think about where you want to locate, and this is like a twofold thing for me. Like, one, like, I really want to operate near LA because that's where my family lives. These are personal considerations. I guess I put that in one bucket. But the other thing you want to look at is like, how friendly is the locality? So like what we're seeing in California, and I'm sure happens in other states, is you almost see kind of like hubs. So we have Desert Hot Springs and Adelanto, and those they basically have these huge like campuses. And the city's made it really easy. You can get a conditional use permit for this one full street block, and they someone will finance building a huge facility, and then they basically rent out the space to different people. And so and then in Adelanto, the licensing process is really easy, and the taxes are really low. So, when you're kind of thinking about how to choose a property, think first about like how easy is it to get the local license? And then, the other thing I would consider is it a merit or a land use based process, right? So, if it's a merit or competitive, and that usually is limited to retail, although I've seen it for non-retail uses. Those are always going to be much more expensive than a land use based process. So I guess if that doesn't make sense to you, I'll explain quickly. That there might be a city like West Hollywood. They're offering X number of licenses. I think it was 64, but that might be wrong. And 300 people are applying for these 64 licenses, right? So even though you spend the money to secure the property, to write the application, still no guarantee that you're even going to be one of the top performers and get that license, right? So it's a lot of, and that's a lot of initial expense, and then with no kind of guarantee. Now some cities are just land use process. If you're in the right zone and you're 1,000 feet away from whatever you need, they say that you need to be 1,000 feet away from, and you can get that conditional use permit or minor use permit or whatever process they require. If you can get that approved, then you get the license. So, I think that, and I guess I'll let Adam speak before I could keep going, but I'll let this be more of a dialogue.
I agree with everything. No, I agree with everything you're saying. I mean, obviously, it's the easiest to go to cities where people are the friendliest. And we see those hubs as well. They're here in Illinois. We've seen them in Massachusetts, like the city of Worcester, Massachusetts. I mean, everyone's in Worcester, Massachusetts. Maryland too.
Yeah.
Maryland did a better job of requiring people to be spaced out. But so I agree with everything you're saying, that you got to consider whether you want to go someplace easy, but also just to play the counterpoint, like if you can get somewhere where it's really hard, you can be that one person in
Sure.
that city center, then you're sitting in the catbird seat. And we've seen issues like that, especially in Florida. South Beach is a really good example, and there's been litigation down there with one of the facilities that's I think closest to South Beach around this. And so, the path of least resistance is always great, but to Amanda's point, you could wind up with a lot of competition.
That's such a good point. You're right.
So what are some of the most common restrictions you guys are seeing municipalities put on cannabis businesses? And I know it's different, if we're talking retail or cultivation or manufacturing, but let's talk about retail. I feel like there's obviously a lot of interest in retail, especially in these merit or limited license jurisdictions. What are some of the most common restrictions you're seeing on the local level?
It's funny. I'm doing some research for San Francisco right now, and I have the page pulled up, and it says cannabis retail locations cannot be within 600 feet of a school or another cannabis retail business. So I don't know if I think those two are the biggest ones. No, that's exactly what
I was going to say too. Is setbacks. Setbacks is the biggest thing. And what we mean by setbacks, everybody, is the cannabis, and Amanda talked about this earlier, but the dispensary can't be more than 500 feet. It has to be more than 500 feet from a school. It has to be more than 1,000 feet from a religious institution. One of my early days, interesting examples, but it's important, is the cannabis dispensary had to be 1,500 feet. Couldn't be within 1,500 feet of a daycare. And what we didn't realize,
the daycare is so tough.
So tough, because what we didn't realize when we were doing the daycare is, especially in these highly populated, dense cities, is a lot of these big businesses have a qualified daycare inside of them for their employees. You don't even know it. And so you think you found the perfect spot because there's no school around, there's no church around, there's no hospital around. And then all of a sudden there's some big business down the street that has a daycare for their employees. So it was pretty interesting. Like, it was pretty interesting, and never thought about that. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, I just the related thing is, like, you always want to check with the locality about when your place is locked in, right? So, like, we had a client who had submitted their application. It was being processed, and in the meantime, a qualified daycare popped up, like literally next door, and it knocked them out, because the rule in that city was that your location wasn't locked in place until the permit was issued. And so basically they didn't even know it, but they were in a race this whole time with this daycare that was also trying to get their permit. And it was just the daycare got it first, and so the storefront got knocked out. So, like, really want to make sure, because some localities will lock your location in as soon as you submit the application, and that means that, like, if a sensitive use does show up around, in the meantime, you're safe. But that's one thing that one is such a bummer when that happens.
So what advice can you give our listeners on how to go about making sure you are complying with the setback. And before you enter into these property agreements, we've been talking about that your property is A-okay. What are some tools that they can use? I mean, because a lot of these people are new to the industry, right? So is it just looking at Google Maps? What's the best way to go about figuring out whether or not you've got a good property?
You want me to go ahead?
Adam, do you want to go ahead?
Typically we're using, real estate companies, realtors that are going out there, and a lot of these realtors have software that identifies it. And, that's not what I do, but I'm pretty impressed by, I've seen this. I mean, I've been through it with my clients. It's crazy. They can identify, as the crow flies in a certain radius, what's there, what's not there. So, from a lawyer's perspective, we bake those contingencies into the contracts, right? So we'll go to the landlord and we'll say, we're going to sign this lease. We're going to get a 90-day due diligence period, or however long we can negotiate, or 45 days. The signing of this lease is contingent on meeting the state, right? We keep it very broad in our contracts, meaning all state, local regulatory requirements for the permitted use, which is, as Amanda said, you got to disclose it's cannabis and so forth. So from a lawyer's perspective, we can navigate that in the agreement to make sure that we don't go hard until we nail that down. Because sometimes people get really excited about a property and just want to lock it in right now and figure it out later. But from an actual kind of bird dogging, whether it actually works, there are companies out there, there's software out there for people to use that you can plug into different setbacks and they can show you what's available. I don't know what your experience, Amanda, is.
I know. I was going to say the same thing. Like, if you can hire a professional, that's always the way to go. But if you're kind of trying to do it yourself, I would say, I even, when a client tells me this is their property, you can go on Google Maps and they have a measure tool. And I also always think, again, like, if you are trying to do it, as the actual applicant, work with the city. I think, like, the planning department in the city, that they in my experience are pretty helpful. But yeah, I think if you want to, it's always best to have that kind of third party verification. And then they can vouch for you. They vouch for you too, so, like, that assurance is helpful, and then also, like, financially it is helpful, because they're that might be the requirement that you need, per the lease or whatever it is to get the wiggle room out of the lease. If you're like, but I have this document that said that a professional said it was fine. So these are kind of things that assurances you can put in your lease. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and you bring up a really good point, because, and you keep saying this about going to the city, and that's no, I know it's a really good point, because it's oftentimes overlooked that many of these cities, despite it being cannabis and everyone, having their opinions about it, they're your partners. They want to be helpful.
So true.
And sometimes you can go to these cities and you can just ask them, where will you let me put a dispensary, or where will you let me put a cultivation center? Those are the easy ones. And in some cities, and we've dealt with that in a couple of different states, will tell us, no way in hell are you putting anything cannabis here. And then
so good to know that up front. Yeah.
Well, yeah,
so good to know that's how they feel.
Right. It's good to know that up front, because some people don't want to fight and they'll walk away from it. But then we have some, deep pocketed, operators who want their dispensary there, and there's no real legal justification for them to be turned down. And then we sue them. And we've done that. And, we win some, and, we lose some, but, like, that's a really good point that you keep bringing up about talking to the city, because they could very well be a good ally for you.
Yeah. And I guess it depends on, again, like, whether it's a locality that is friendly. And, I guess I do keep bringing it up, but because I know that it's, like, it is possible to navigate some of this by yourself. And, and if someone's trying to keep a cost down, like, I think that is, it's a real option.
Definitely. Yeah, I think that's a great point to make too. And we're thinking about all of these new jurisdictions coming online, right? Whether it be New York or New Jersey, we're seeing things move in Alabama, states like that, where localities may have the ability to opt out or they're required to opt in. So they're not going to have restrictions right now. And this is an opportunity to get in there and start working with the city early, right? And making those relationships, which it sounds like can be so important.
Yeah. Well, that's Jericho, that's your bread and butter. I feel like, we've worked together for many years, and that is one thing that I hear you say over and over to clients is start early building those community relations, right?
Definitely. So we've got about 10 more minutes here. Just for, our listeners that are newer to the industry, can you guys just briefly explain, what does it look like, the process on the local level, securing your property, but then going to the city and getting what you need from the city? Are you guys seeing, what does a special use permit process look like? Or is it just general zoning? What's the difference there, and how should they approach that process?
Man, do you want to take that one?
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. So, again, you just want to check the locality, right? Because there is like, the barrier to entry, it can vary drastically by the city. So, like I mentioned before, like if you go to Desert Hot Springs, there's probably a massive operator who has a huge warehouse who's already done the conditional use permit for you. And all then you have to do is secure the cannabis business license. But I'll say at the local level, typically what I see is, even if it's a competitive process and you went through the entire competitive process and you won the storefront, that typically just means that you have been invited to now submit the next steps. And so what you typically see is like a two-part thing. So you need the land use entitlement, and that can vary based on, are you doing a brand new build out, or are you just renovating? Or not, are you building a new building, or are you just renovating? And so that might, require, a more thorough and larger, building a new building, will require, a larger and more sophisticated land use process where you might actually have to go before the planning board, whereas just a build out of an existing building might just require a minor conditional use permit. And then so you'll have to deal with that land use process. And then after that is approved, you typically also then have to fill out a cannabis business license application. And those can be pretty straightforward, but they can also be quite involved. And so, I think like at a minimum, they're going to want to see, secure placement of security cameras, a layout of the premises, your business formation documents. And I don't want to get too deep into kind of all the requirements of licensing, but you will have to do you will likely have to do a two-part sort of process at the local level. And then always remember too that there's typically a state license involved too. So at least in California and New Jersey, they're not going to deny your state application if the locality's approved it, so long as you provide all the documents you need. But yeah, I guess I would think about it, first there's a local and state approval. So always check to see, to confirm that in fact is the case. And then at the local level, you'll have to parse through like what the requirements are. And usually that is some sort of land use entitlement, and then also a cannabis business license. But again, every locality is different. They have a lot of discretion. So you'll really want to just, once you kind of, focus in on an area, maybe I'm looking at all the cities in Riverside County, kind of focus geographically, and then kind of start looking at all the localities in that area, and you'll start to get a sense of, which ones it might be easier to apply in, or, at Adam's point, like harder to apply in, but that makes your business more valuable because you might be the only one, operating there.
Adam, any last thoughts on that topic?
No, I think that's right. Some things to think about is a lot of times you'll have to have the local police, bless the security plan. They'll come.
Our fire department.
Stores. Fire department in many states like Illinois, Massachusetts. I think New York has the requirement now. You have to tie your security cameras into the police departments. The police has to have 24-hour access to your cameras. So there's a lot of nuances at the local level to get these approvals. I think that, from a step-by-step basis, from an entitlement perspective, sometimes you go before the zoning board 2, 3, 4 times. They'll have public comments. So you'll present your plans, and they'll put it on put it out for public comments. The next time you'll have all these people show up, and some people are like, I want cannabis in my backyard. Someone else will be like, never, I'll die before I'll die before cannabis comes here. So you have all that, and everyone comes and expresses their opinions, and then there's another hearing. So it's usually several hearings before you get approval. But what's important is just understanding if it's permitted in the first place, right? So places are going to be zoned to allow it, or you're going to ask them to rezone in an area for it to be allowed. Typically, it's already zoned, because when they bake in the regulations, they look at their own zoning code and they'll say, cannabis can be in zone C4, because they've already figured out what C4 means on the planning map. But sometimes you might, in any event, there's going to be lots of hearings.
Right. Definitely. So, question from the audience, not necessarily real estate related, and I'm happy to take this one too, is Florida accepting new medical marijuana treatment clinic applications? I can take that one. We're doing quite a bit of work in Florida right now. The answer is yes. Right now, they have published an application for a Pigford applicant only. That application window ends on March 25th. You do have to meet a very, very strict ownership qualification that the majority owner has to have been part of the Pigford class action, which happened many, many years ago. There are a very limited number of people who actually qualify for that license, and they're only giving one of those. So after that, however, we do expect to see a general licensing process open up for MMTCs that are not specific to Pigford applicants. And we're hoping to see, anywhere from 16 to 20 something licenses there. Obviously, very valuable vertically integrated licenses. We do expect that to be a very competitive licensing process. So the answer is yes. We hope that the application process will open up to not just the Pigford applicants, but sometime in 2022 to also the larger pool of general applicants. Okay, guys. Well, we've got about 5 more minutes. So I'll give an opportunity for the audience to post any last minute questions that they'd like to hear answers to. In the meantime, any parting thoughts, Adam and Amanda, as far as real estate goes, whether it be landlord tenant related or just general considerations and best practices, tips?
I think, from my perspective is, it seems daunting.
I know. I feel like we were very scary, Adam.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big undertaking to get a cannabis operation open, cultivation, processing, or dispensary. There's a lot of hoops to jump through, but the good news is that I think the people on this screen, at least, we've been around this industry now long enough that, we are, seasoned professionals, and we can help you out. Hire the right people, get people that know what they're doing, because each one, you can get your hand held through this process. Because I know we all made it sound like it's this daunting task, and quite honestly, it's a lot. When this industry first got started, and how I first got started into it, and it was, people equated it to the gaming industry, and I had some gaming experience. Because you can't just build casinos places, and you can't just get a casino license and zoning. Yeah, and but you can do it. And everyone on this call who's listening or on the Zoom who's watching, if you're interested in a cannabis license, call one of us. We're happy to give you our ear, or send us an email or whatever, and we'll help you get through it. Because once you get there, it's a fun business to be in. I'm not going to tell you that everyone's making riches, but a lot of people are, and it's a fun place to be in. It's it's new, it's constantly evolving. It's a fun space to practice.
Yeah, and I think it's an important space to practice in. And especially as an attorney, we're kind of charting new legal territory. I guess my closing thoughts, I'm just kind of looking back at my notes from what we discussed on the call, and as a licensing attorney, I think again the zoning and the setbacks, like finding the right location that isn't going to get bumped out, because I think we talked earlier that locations, for the most part, that they're going to want you to be there, right? And so I think you just have to go through it with the attitude is like, don't give them a reason to deny you. So long as you have everything in order and you are making best efforts to kind of comply with their rules, they're gonna want to work with you. So I think making sure that you find a property that does meet those requirements, and then and that's kind of what I would say about dealing with the locality in terms of dealing with your landlord. I think it's important to be really upfront with them throughout the entire process. Never try to pretend that you're not doing cannabis there. So that will only get you into trouble later, and would probably be impossible because of all of the documents that do require that the land the landlord or the property owner sign saying that they would allow this use. So and try to find a landlord who is going to be supportive and that you get the sense that they aren't going to try to later sort of price gouge you for increases to lease price or to sign a property document.
Right. Yeah. Okay, guys. Well, I think that's a wrap. Thank you both so much, Adam and Amanda. It's been great. A lot for the audience to consider there. Definitely follow up with Amanda or Adam if you have follow-up questions.
Sure.
And tune in next month for our next legal roundtable. You should be getting an email about that, and reach out to the National Hispanic Cannabis Council if you'd like to be added to the list. We appreciate everyone and hope the new year's been treating everybody great. Have a wonderful 2022. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Jericho.
Thank you for having us.
Bye.
Bye.